That has been raging really since the 90s on the possibility of moving the legislative arm of Parliament to the mother city. In fact, the move has been to centralize all these arms, the judicial, the legislative, and the administrative, to one center. We put this question to you on the poll on Newzroom Afrika 405. The fire at Parliament this week has reignited the debate about moving the institution from the Western Cape to Gauteng. What are your thoughts? Do you think it's a great idea, it's a bad idea, or MPs can meet online? 58.5% of you online on Twitter believing that it is a great idea, while only 15.9% say it's a bad idea, and 25.6% saying MPs can meet online. Well, that debate has been going on, and to help us for some insight and analysis tonight, we are joined by Dr. Stembile Mbete. We have also from the University of Pretoria. We also have Wits University Professor Lawrence Hamilton, as well as political journalist Yan Jube. Good evening to you, and thank you for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus. Prof. Hamilton, let me begin with you. I mean, what are the reasons, whether it be historical, whether it be it's sentimental, whether it be it political, that we have this thing of the legislative and the administrative and the judicial capital in South Africa?
Good evening, Thabo, and good evening to your viewers. If you're asking me why we have this split of a judicial arm and an executive arm and a legislative arm in three different cities, it's actually just a consequence of an argument that took place in the creation of the Union in 1961, where it was difficult to decide between the provinces who would hold which power, which arm of government, and so a compromise was found where the three arms of governance would be placed in three different cities. South Africa is quite unique in that way. It's, the joke on the ground is that we have this idea of the separation of powers, and South Africa took it to its literal extreme. It really separated them between Pretoria, Bloemfontein, and Cape Town.
Yeah, well, one would
There's
argue.
no reason, really.
I mean, some would argue right now there's been overreach, maybe in certain instances, from the judiciary into the state and so on and so forth. And it's a debate that is out there. Maybe you would ask the question, how effective has it been then to have these separate capitals?
I think it's always been a rather strange sort of accident of history. I don't see the logic in having them separated in this way. It seems to waste a great deal of money, moving people back and forth, having people have more than one house. All of this is paid for by the taxpayer. Seems to be a highly inefficient and rather odd way of proceeding. I thought that moving into a democratic dispensation would have been the perfect opportunity to change that. 1994. Here we are, so many years later, and we still haven't done it. And it's not actually a new debate, as you said. It's something that's been on the horizon. It's been something that the ANC has entertained. It's something that there's been various reports about. For me, it makes full sense to have all three arms of government in one place, the capital. Yeah.
Dr. Stembile, it's a devastating thing. I mean, to have learned it at the start of the year that there was this blaze that literally destroyed the old assembly and the new assembly. Its effects still being felt, including the postponement or at least the relocation of the State of the Nation address, and a debate going on how Parliament will continue going forward to carry out its business. Are these reasons enough to change South Africa's legislative capital to the mother city?
Well, look, I think that the fire that took place at Parliament is deeply unfortunate, deeply concerning, and obviously we want to, the legal system to take its course. But I think that certainly that having happened, it does reopen, it provides a very practical and pragmatic reason to reopen the debate on the moving of Parliament to where the executive seat of of the country is, which is Pretoria. And as Prof. Hamilton has said, the decision on splitting the capitals between then in 1910 the Bloemfontein as the judicial capital, Pretoria's as the executive, and Cape Town's legislative one, was really a compromise. It came out of the South African War, or the Anglo-Boer War, and the negotiation of combining the South African, the Transvaal Republic, the Free State, and the Cape and the Natal colonies, which belonged to Britain. And so we are sitting here with a legacy from colonial decisions that were being made that really is not appropriate for our current democratic dispensation. And one of the reasons it's not appropriate for our current democratic dispensation is that it makes governance incredibly difficult. It makes accountable governance very, very difficult. And so we have an opportunity now, especially having heard how much money it's going to actually cost to restore the National Assembly. And I think it's about time to have a conversation about whether we can afford to keep spending the money that we do, as Prof. Hamilton said, moving people between Pretoria and Cape Town several times a week.
I want you to give us a little bit of context of that governance dividends that can be derived from moving the capital, legislative capital to the mother city. But Yan, let me bring you in here. Some have actually made this argument that, well, it's a good opportunity to break away with that colonial framework that Peter Stembele is talking of. I'm talking at EFF in particular, who have made that call in a letter that they wrote following the fire in Parliament. What's your take?
Good evening to you and to the viewers. Just to correct the history a little bit, it comes from the South African Convention, which took place 1908 to 1910, when the 4 colonies became one union, and each colony got something. So that's the judicial to the Free State, the executive to the old Transvaal, which is now Gauteng, and we in the Western Cape got the legislative, and just for interest's sake, Natal got the post office. It was based in Pietermaritzburg, so poor Natal didn't do too well. But the argument surely now is not how it came about, but what we should do about it. The EFF has made the point, and I agree with him, and that's also what Stembele said, that it's a good time to have this conversation. The argument has always been that Parliament is incredibly expensive to build, and that it is here in Cape Town already. Now it no longer is, to a large degree, and it has to, and a lot of building has to take place anyway. I would, however, caution that the extent of the project not be underestimated. Parliament is a massive complex, of which part has now burnt down. But it consists of a lot of people who work here. I think there are about 1,500 people who work in Parliament, and many of them are very specialized. So would they have to now be moved? Also, the number of areas which have not burnt down must also be taken into consideration. And also, I'm afraid to say, our government's record when building and staying within cost and tenders and the like. So I would be very, very careful to say that it's going to be less expensive to build a new Parliament in Pretoria. Given large building efforts by our government, and for instance, Madupi and Kusile spring to mind, I would be very careful, and I would want to propose that if this be done, we look at the tender situation and the changes that were made there for the 2010 World Cup, because I see a chance for massive corruption should a new legislature be built in the north of the country.
I'm saying we are underestimating the cost of the move. I mean, in 2016, I think, the last estimate they looked at was 7 billion rands to move a parliament to the capital city. And as you put it, close to 1,400 families that would need to be uprooted, which is a massive social cost in itself.
Indeed, and also these costs tend to balloon. At this stage, we have basic infrastructure in Cape Town in place. If you're going to recreate the thing, the delusions of grandeur that there's going to be within officialdom, I think are too ghastly to contemplate. I have no idea how they're going to decide who's going to design it, who's going to build it, who's going to get the tenders, who's going to be the in-betweens. We've seen the Zondo Commission. I want to raise that alarm.
Yeah. Why has there been no progress on the matter? Because it has been raised previously and there have been a number of feasibility studies that have been conducted. Well, we'll get to that question also in a moment. Plus, interrogate a little bit further, what is the governance dividends to be derived from this particular move? Let's get to the conversation, of course, that has been going on for decades. It's just been refreshed now with the fires that broke out in Parliament. Should the legislative capital be moved to the capital city in Tshwane? Others arguing that this would, of course, make for better governance, but also make sense, Gauteng being the gateway into Africa and into the world. Well, Dr. Stembele Mbete, Professor Lawrence Hamilton, as well as Yanya Nyube, helping us with that conversation. Prof. Hamilton, of course, as I mentioned, this has been argued a number of times, and there have been many feasibility studies being done, and I suppose it was also revived recently, where it was almost as if it's now a done deal. Literally, what is just left to happen is to iron out the nitty-gritties. Of course, there's no act currently that speaks to this particular move and all those things that would need to be put in place. But what has actually been delaying the progress on the matter?
Frankly, Tabo, the normal things that delay the political processes, inertia, conservatism, the inherent conservatism of what you have, as opposed to what you might be able to generate with this proposal. I mean, I think we have to take very seriously Yanyan's concerns about cost implications and also potential corruption problems, etc. But I don't think those arguments ought to get in the way of overcoming some of the massive logistical problems that our governance structures that we've inherited generate. I mean, the idea that we need to have these massive separations in distance and the costs involved in order for us to somehow keep our representatives in check, in other words, keep them more accountable, is a mad idea. In effect, a much better way of keeping our legislature in particular, or rather our executive in particular, accountable, is to actually have the legislative and the judicial right next door to them. And it makes logistical sense as well, because a lot of the committees that people have to sit on in these various arms of government work with one another, if not constitute the same entity in some cases. So there are a hell of a lot of important logistical questions that, as you put it, would generate really important governance dividends, particularly around exactly the point around accountability, how we best hold our representatives accountable. We do so in an environment in which there is these different powers that constitute our government, and they act to check one another. And what better way of ensuring that they check one another, that they're in one place checking one another. So there's both logistical and accountability arguments that I think weigh quite heavily in favor of having them all in one place. So, as in every political decision, there's a cost implication, there's a governance issue, and there's a whole lot of other things that you've got to take into consideration. And a big move of this kind, I mean, it doesn't surprise me at all in a way, even despite what I said earlier. It doesn't surprise me at all that it hasn't taken place, because it's an enormous move.
Talk about those financial implications. What are the budgetary and financial implications of this move? And in the current fiscal climate in which the country finds itself in, but maybe even all countries in the world really find themselves in, does it warrant this relocation, or does it merit this relocation?
So as I'm trying to suggest, I don't think it should be, this kind of decision shouldn't be made simply in terms of cost considerations. But the latest assessment that I saw, which I think was undertaken in 2021, does in any case give a positive cost implication. In other words, it says it's going to cost, I think the figure, as you say, was 7 billion, but then that would save over 300 million a year. So the cost implication would be one that would easily be repaid quite quickly. Obviously taking into consideration Yan Yan's concerns, but then if you let Yan Yan's concerns get in the way of making this kind of judgment, you'll never be able to make any political judgment really, because if corruption is endemic, then the logical conclusion to that argument is that there ought to be no political judgments, there ought to be no political decisions, which is a difficult place to end up.
Yeah, Dr. Belly, I mean, the easiest dividends in governance, one that I saw being picked up was the fact that, for example, a member of parliament could forget very important documents in Johannesburg on their flight to Cape Town. And when they get to Cape Town, that whole entire meeting would need to be cancelled, and they would delay them being held accountable in some of the biggest issues that would need answers to. I mean, what is the dividends that we would get?
They could also be very distracted by the fact that they're going to such a lovely place. They might forget all the really important arguments that they had in meetings in Pretoria.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that the argument actually is not so much around members of parliament, but around members of the executive. So one of the consequences of having this split into cities between the executive and the legislature is that for the executive to account in person to Parliament, they need to travel from Tshwane to Cape Town. And often we've seen this with ministers. We've also seen it with heads of other government institutions or state institutions like the state-owned enterprises, is that they tend to use that logistical matter of traveling from Tshwane to Cape Town to get out of being held accountable. So whether they'll say, well, no, I left an important document in Tshwane and we can't have this meeting without it, and so then the meeting gets postponed to another time, or whether there's scheduling issues that are then used, and it sounds really frivolous, but it's not. We've seen on numerous occasions, I would even hazard to say, almost hundreds of occasions over the last 27 years, where the executive and heads of other state institutions have used the logistical issues of traveling between Tshwane and Cape Town to dodge accountability in Parliament. And when Parliament and the executive are in the same city, it's immensely difficult to do. At the moment, it's very difficult for Parliament to summon a minister to account around PPE corruption, for example. To tell the Minister of Health that you have to be in Parliament first thing tomorrow morning is a logistically very difficult thing for Parliament.
Well, some are arguing to that now things are even easier because we have this hybrid model, so they're doing it online, so they can, I suppose, transfer these documents from the comfort of their own home, in which they're making that as the argument to say, well, we don't really need to move Parliament then.
Well, I mean, as we are seeing in 2022, and for those who started work yesterday or last week, the hybrid way of doing things is going to have an end date, right? I think that there is a very high likelihood that within the next 3 or 4 years, we'll be back to doing things in person, and particularly around having Parliament. I think that one of the other challenges of having Parliament in Cape Town, where the vast majority of the 400 members of Parliament that we have do not live in Parliament or in Cape Town or anywhere near there, is that getting MPs to be at work as they've needed to be in the last year since the end of the very harsh lockdowns has been immensely difficult. And so for logistical purposes as well, being that we are heading back to a world of in-person meetings, of in-person consultations, I think that it'll make a lot more sense to have Parliament in close proximity to the executive, because at the moment, consulting Parliament, accounting to Parliament is a nice to have. It's not something that our executive feels that they need to do. And the spatial considerations, I think, are very important in that respect.
Daniel, you agree? Is it a good idea to centralize the work of Parliament?
Not specifically, and not for the reasons given. Firstly, the legal imperative to have Parliament in Cape Town is not just plucked from the sky, it is in the Constitution. So therefore, we will need a constitutional change. That will take a long time anyway. We've seen with the efforts to change Section 25 of the Constitution, that's taken them 4 years to decide not to do it. So it's going to be a long process. In the meantime, Parliament has to meet. I don't recall quite so many problems with people forgetting documents. I've now covered Parliament since 2001. That's now 21 years. Yes, it's time to move on, is it not? My life's going nowhere. But fine. In 21 years, I specifically recall 3 times that people have used that excuse. Let's make it 10. Maybe I missed 7, which is unlikely, but it's possible. Then it's not that big a problem. And the point you made about, anyone can email a document really from anywhere in the world. So I do agree that there has to, at some point, we have to move back to face-to-face meetings. It's been such a concern that we have not had that. We have in our country a terrible history of silo thinking and of people disregarding one another's humanity. Yeah. So I fully agree that on a personal level, and this personal level is exceedingly important, your opponent in another political party becomes just that, an opponent. If you see them every day in a meeting and you hear that they have children too and maybe they like fish paste and maybe you don't want to kill them quite so easily because they are not an enemy, they're an opponent. So I'm absolutely in favor of us moving to more face-to-face meetings for every reason, especially given our history. But that said, I don't know whether we can't just do it anyway and whether it's that important where Parliament is for that to take place. Yeah. I do not think that we need to move it to Pretoria because Pretoria isn't where the MPs live anyway. And whether you have the American system with a huge country and lots of people moving around and centralized government in Washington, you still have to call in the people from the provincial governments and the like. And then lastly, I think that there is a problem where you might have an overly focused attention being given to Gauteng. I think all our viewers in Limpopo, in Northwest, in the Eastern Cape, Free State, Northern Cape, know what it's like when the focus is not on you. The place goes to pot. I think it is good in the Western Cape that at least the city of Cape Town has fire engines to put out a fire. Yeah. Many other cities are not quite in the same position. What I'm asking is that people think of all the pros and cons.
We'll definitely come to that. I see Dr. Stembele wanting to weigh in as well. The argument has been made that that move would particularly decimate the economy of the Western Cape, but is that reason enough to keep Parliament in Cape Town? Dr. Stembele Mbete, Professor Lawrence Hamilton, and Yanya Newbear tonight. The conversation, of course, is the one that's been happening everywhere, a possibility of the Parliament being moved to the capital city here in Tshwane. Yanya, I want to take you back before I allow Dr. Stembele to respond as well to what you're raising. To this question of one seat of government actually saves time and it saves travel costs. Covering Parliament for as long as you have, what's your feeling on the fact that, for example, if you've got 2 departments collaborating on a particular matter, at a given point, if they have to fly the whole entire staff, it would cost you flights of over 60 people at a given time for just one meeting?
Well, Kabu, that sounds nice, as a good argument. It isn't, though, because, quite frankly, you don't have to fly everybody, and no one does. They fly a few people to be held accountable, and if you look at the figures that Professor Hamilton gave, I assume they are correct. And we're going to save 300 million rand a year to build something that costs 7 billion rand instead of the current 1 billion rand bill to repair the damage to the current building. Well, then it will take almost as long as I've covered Parliament to redeem those costs. That's quite a long time. So the argument is not quite as simple as people make it. And also, you don't have to fly the whole department. You can fly the top 3 people and the rest can join. You can do hybrid meetings. Yeah. What we should have is a place where the people's representatives, the 454, 400 in National Assembly, 54 in National Council of Provinces, they must meet in person. The rest don't specifically have to be there, just the top people.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, that would be nice. But sometimes others use this as an opportunity to go to Cape Town because it's so nice and it's a fantastic paid-for holiday.
Might I just add that this is why I live here. It is a wonderful place, and everybody in the interior, you must visit it all the time. You'll be happier people, as will be our parliamentarians.
Well, there's the argument that Tswana is certainly not accessible for all parliamentarians, according to Yan, saying most of the MPs actually live in Cape Town.
Well, I'm not sure if that's what Yan had said earlier, but and look, Yan, I know, you know, I love Cape Town. I lived there for nearly 9 years, best place. But having said that, and I thoroughly enjoyed working close to Parliament in Cape Town. Having said that, it seems to me that we're having 2 kind of separate conversations. And the one is around all of the logistical challenges of making this move. And I think that has been the disincentive towards making the move, and why during the period of the negotiated settlement from 1990 to 1994, and then the period of the constitutional negotiations from 1994 to 1996, it was decided to actually just keep things the way they are, because there was enough changing in the country as it was. And I think that was a really wasted opportunity, because it has meant that we've kept on delaying this conversation and delaying a decision that I think is inevitably going to have to happen, because the second part of the conversation that I think we are having here is one on principle. In principle, does it make sense for the health of our democracy for the executive and the legislative to be separated in the way that they are? And in thinking about the health of that democracy, we've talked about the accountability issues. The second thing for me is that Parliament is the representative body of our democracy. Our members of Parliament, whether they believe it or not, are public representatives that are elected to represent the public, and so the public should have access to them regularly, routinely, as they wish to. And although we've got this system of constituency offices and all the rest of it, the reality is that for the vast majority of people in the interior, it is immensely difficult to access your public representatives when they are in Cape Town. Community organizations, even civil society organizations that have far more funding, find it very difficult to engage in Cape Town, and it's become more difficult as time has gone on because of funding. The organization that I worked for when I lived in Cape Town eventually had to close because of funding cuts, and the first office they closed was the Cape Town one because it wasn't affordable anymore. And if you consider that there are 5 provinces that are close, find it easier to access Tshwane than they would do to access Cape Town. I think that as a representative issue, it would make sense in the long term for Parliament to move to Tshwane and to be in the same place as the executive. And I fully appreciate and agree with Yan's concerns around the logistics, around the costs. But, climate catastrophe notwithstanding, our history isn't going to be just the next 20 years, one hopes, right? So the immediate costs of doing something over 5 years and then needing to pay it back over 20 years, in 100 years' time, we're likely to still be having this conversation if something does not change.
Especially considering that if we did this I think 15 years ago it would have cost 238 million rands, and now it's costing 7 billion rands. So things will get more expensive with time the longer we wait. But speaking of the human resource implications and the human capital implications, the Chief of Policy and Strategy at ATM, as a political party also represented in Parliament, Zanele Manyi, weighed in on this particular matter and put a tweet out when this debate was raging. It's an interesting tweet, and maybe I want you to weigh in on it, what your thoughts are on this. Saying this move would mean let's make Cape Town white again. If the move to Gauteng finally happens, all the black members of Parliament and staff and their families will vacate Cape Town. For this reason, Parliament must not move to Gauteng. Prof. Lawrence?
Yeah, I think we'll leave that to one side, to be quite honest, because it literally doesn't make that much sense, does it?
I'm happy to.
I think the more important question, I think the much more important question is the one that Sitembile has been highlighting, and that is the really, really central issue around accountability in our governance. You know, there are a lot of things that are affecting our lack of accountability. One is our partyless proportional representation system, which ought to be changed, I believe. But Sitembile's points are really on point in the sense that we need an executive and a legislative structure that are working with one another, keeping one another in check, and forcing our public representatives to act in the interests of the broader South African good and sets of goods and interests. Currently, that's not the case. And I don't think we can blame, of course, this absurd separation of powers for that situation. But I think there's a good argument to be made to suggest that it would help matters somewhat if we could have all of these representatives in one place and more accessible to the general populace.
Right. Jan, do you want to weigh in on the transformation issue and the turning Cape Town white again?
Well, not too much. I fully agree, actually, with Stembile and Lawrence that the main issues are not whether Mr. Manyi believes, he's been in trouble before for these statements on Cape Town, if you will recall, when he was in a previous incarnation. And he also doubles up as spokesperson for some other organizations, which we shall not mention. So the point being that we must not be distracted. I think both points are well made. And this is why the discussion must be had. And that discussion must not be had emotionally. Cape Town has never been white. Cape Town is a predominantly colored area. It's not predominantly white. And it is more and more Africans are moving to Cape Town. And that is a great thing for the Western Cape because it diversifies the Western Cape and makes every time that Mr. Manyi makes those assumptions, it makes it less true. So to pull the race card in a debate, which really should be about logistics, about what Lawrence said, which is that our governance system clearly isn't working. Stembile made the point that many of our public representatives, they know they're representative, but they forget about the public. Those are the points to be made. And the great thing about what has happened, perhaps the only great thing, is that it will open up this conversation. And then this conversation must be had on a higher level than to play the race card, especially in such a nonsensical way.
Well, others have argued that maybe this particular argument no longer relevant right now. There's been opposition to this move because removing this high-profile legislature from the city governed by the opposition would have been a matter. But now, of course, the DA governs the city of Cape Town as well as the city of Tshwane. So I suppose that does not make any difference anymore. Peter Stembile?
Can I just weigh in on that? Because yes, the point there is that I don't know whether the people of Tshwane, Ekurhuleni, or Johannesburg see much of their city councillors. It's not a matter of geographical location. It's a matter of accessibility. And I don't think that it follows that the fact that people will be in Tshwane will make them more accessible than if they are in Cape Town. That's very much the decision of the individual in the first place.
Dr. Stembile?
Look, I think that Yanyan's point about the accessibility of MPs is a valid one, and I think of public representatives in general to the public in general, I think is a very valid one, as we have seen with city councillors. However, I think that the public is represented in a number of ways, and organized civil society, organized formations of communities, etc., do access city councils, and they do access their representatives as the councillors. Whether that accessing them leads to responsive governance can be a whole other conversation, and that's an issue, and that's a completely different issue. However, the point that I was making is not necessarily about individuals trying to access Parliament, although I do think more individuals should be going to Parliament, but the fact that organizations that represent people of all classes, of all backgrounds across the country find it far more difficult to access Parliament in Cape Town than they do to access the executive seat, which is in Tshwane, which is why, and I worked at the union buildings and well, quite a while ago now, but that's why you have protests at the union buildings all the time, because people can get to Tshwane. And it's very difficult to get into the union building, so people are out on the lawns, they're on the they're on the drive on the pavements. But the point is that people go to the executive when they want to complain, which actually isn't necessarily where they should be going. They should be going to their public representatives, to their members of Parliament that they elect every 5 years. And so that's the point that I was making around accessibility. I do think that, and here I'm going to be somewhat controversial in relation to what Mr. Mani said. I do think that one of the in terms of the broader economic arguments around moving Parliament is that Parliament is a big employer in Cape Town, and many of the people that Parliament does employ are people of African and are Africans and colours and all levels of employment in Parliament. And so there are a huge number of people that would be put out of pocket and affected by moving Parliament. But again, this gets back to my earlier point about needing to weigh this principal conversation about what we want our democracy to look like, and then all of the logistical implications of making a decision such as this, which is going to be hugely massive.
The debate on the move of Parliament to Tshwane continues, and Dr. Stembile Mbeta, Professor Lawrence Hamilton, journalist Yanyan, you bear with us tonight weighing in on that. What are the merits for the move to the capital city? Why not Limpopo? Why not Mpumalanga? Why not anywhere else? To Gauteng particularly getting an unfair focus, Prof?
Well, I mean, you know, the reality is that Gauteng is the economic hub of the country. It is, in many ways, the draw card for so many people across the region from, you know, not just Limpopo, but even beyond Limpopo. So, you know, I'm not a Joburger by origin, so I don't stand by Gauteng for any personal reasons, but I think it makes sense for those reasons, in the sense that Sitembile was talking about earlier, the idea that Gauteng is kind of at the center of a wheel that draws in people from all around, so there is a really important sort of practical consideration, but there is also, just to add a third component to this argument, not just around practicality and logistics and about principle, but also about sort of another component of the representational politics that we're talking about, and that is the sort of the spectacle of where power lies. The idea that you have a central locus of power, and it's to that locus and from that locus that you will move as a citizenry, as different groups defending different interests, that is absolutely vital, I think, for a functioning democracy. So if there's a central locus, that is the basis of power, even though, of course, formally there's a separation of these powers. that are supposed to keep them each in check and balance. It makes sense so I would go even further and say that the judiciary should also be in the same place as the executive and the legislature. It doesn't make any sense to me why they should be separate. As I say, it's an accident of history. Yeah. There's a really important consideration about how power functions in politics and how we as citizens are given agency in various ways and have agency taken away from us in various ways by our representational structure. That ironically requires us to focus in on a central locus of power, which we call the state. And it's that state, the state of South Africa, that is both, has to be centralized, but it has to also be kept to account and kept to in a situation in which it responds to the whole variety of interests that make up the citizenry and the various bodies that make up the rest of the populace and the country. And I think that with these disparate locales, you have a situation in which that sense of the state being in one single place, the power of the state being centralized in one place, is in some sense lost. I'm not saying this is a massively important argument, but it's just an addition to what we've been saying.
Yeah. Yan, there are some who've argued that, well, look, Cape Town has had its chance and its fair share, and they've really certainly reaped the rewards of this as far as the economy of Cape Town is concerned. It's a turn to give Gauteng as a chance as well, and certainly maybe even the focus will shift from just lawmaking and will shift into talking about the economy, this being the economic hub. Does that debate resonate with you?
With me personally, not at all. I'm sure with many other people. The courts have already, the Apex Court has already been moved to Gauteng, of course, with the Constitutional Court now taking that primary position. I don't know whether that's been good or bad. It's certainly been good, I think, for people of Johannesburg. And I do see, though, that even that was damaged recently, I mean, the physical infrastructure. Whether it's time to give someone else a chance, well, I think that's where Stembile's point comes in. If you're going to move it, it's best to centralize it. It is a debate which has to be had, but it must not be oversimplified. I guess one can make the point that perhaps Durban should be given. I mean, it's got a nice climate. It's also got a sea. It's after the city of Cape Town, the city of eThekwini is probably the metro in the best financial position.
Plus, it also only got the post office, so maybe it would be a good idea.
No, I don't even know. And that was Pietermaritzburg, you know. So I don't know. People in Pietermaritzburg can tell us. I don't know where the post office is these days, and I don't know whether the post office even is these days. But no, I don't believe that this decision should be taken too easily. I think the points made by Lawrence and by Stembile are very good points, but I would want to ask this decision to be taken mathematically and with some sense of business so that we see what we can afford. So yes, maybe it will take 20 years to recoup the money. The problem is we don't have the cash, for instance, to fork out 7 billion, which to me, knowing Parliament pretty well, if it's 1 billion rand for the part that burnt down, then I think it's going to be more than 7 billion to build the old complex. But we'll see how people do those math. But I want to ask that if such a decision is taken, whether it be to keep it in Cape Town or to move it to Bloemfontein or Pofadder or Polokwane, that decision be taken with a lot of economic sense, mathematical figures, and no emotion, please.
Stabile, I mean, is it just enough to dismiss this economic debate to say, well, Cape Town still has tourism, they've got agriculture to fall back on, so they'll be fine, they won't miss Parliament?
Yeah, but the same goes for Bloemfontein. I mean, it's got agriculture and tourism, it just maybe doesn't have so much. Sorry, Stembile, you were saying.
Well, I think that the economic argument is a more complex one. I think the economic argument that Yan is making is a far more complex one. It's about the fiscal position that the country is in currently. It's not just about, where places draw revenue from. And I think that is a valid argument to make, especially in the fiscal conditions that we are facing as a country. Yes, but essentially, in terms of the economic issues around jobs in Cape Town, one of the suggestions that was made a few years ago was that the Pan-African Parliament be moved into the parliamentary precinct that we currently have in Cape Town, and that would be a way also to respond to Mr. Manu's concerns of Africanizing, of keeping and Africanizing the Africanization, rather keeping the Africanization of Cape Town by moving the Pan-African Parliament there. But certainly the issues around the economy, not just of Cape Town, but of the Western Cape broadly, will continue to play at whatever decisions are made. I just want to respond, though, to what Yan said about this must be a decision that's not made emotionally. That's impossible. It will be emotional. It's a decision fundamentally about that goes to the heart of what we imagine South Africa to be, going back to the point that was made at the beginning about how this decision was made in the first place. It was made in the convention and the set of discussions that were about forming the state of South Africa. The state of South Africa was formed in 1910 through this union of these colonies and independent republics, which were colonies kind of at the time. But anyway, it was formed through this combination of these four colonies to form a particular vision of what the state of South Africa is. And that was maintained in the new vision or in a different vision of the state of South Africa that came to be in 1994. And I think a big part of the reason for maintaining the situation as it was is that the biggest concern in 1994 was building a unified, coherent South Africa, right, after the balkanization of the country into the different homelands and the Bantustans and the racial balkanization of the country. The debate that we should be having now, and the question now, is the current arrangement appropriate for the state of South Africa that we want to see in the next 50, 100, 150 years? And that conversation is not going to be without emotion, deep interest, and politics. But I think that it's a valuable conversation to have about who we are really as a state and as a nation.
I appreciate you all, and thank you very much for coming on and sharing your views tonight with us here on In Focus. Professor Lawrence Hamilton, Yanga Nyube, and Dr. Stembile Mbete. Well,